Well, the fun's over. Now you get to listen to me for a little bit. I have been asked to talk about one of the most complex topics in all of neuroscience, so I'm going to talk for 20 minutes, and we're going to see how far we can get. But the goal here is just to give you sort of a bit of a primer on this topic. And this topic is tough to talk about for a couple of reasons. One, it's very complex, but two, it is also emotionally charged, and I don't mean that as a pun, but there is a lot of stigma that goes along with when we start talking about feelings and emotions and psychiatric concerns. And I think sometimes people's minds, when they hear words like psychosis, can go to the worst place, right? You immediately think about how bad things are. And I myself, when I had some years ago, I was working way too much, and I got in a situation where I needed some psychiatric care to get back to work. And when I came back to work, several of my bosses and colleagues said, well, what do you want your cover story to be? I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you can't tell people that this happened. They'll think differently of you. And this is at Michigan State University, right, a place of higher learning. And the trouble is that if we don't talk about these things, we don't get help for these things. And talking about mental health shouldn't be scary. It is extremely common. In fact, when we look at the studies, and I'm going to sort of average the studies here, 75% of people with dementia have experienced behavioral symptoms, neuropsychiatric symptoms, at some point in the last month or so. And when we look at some studies, that number can go as high as 99% of the people who were reported had some sort of psychiatric event. When you look at folks who have two or more symptoms at the same time, it's still about 60% of folks. So these are extremely common, but not commonly talked about. When you look at the diagnostic tools for dementia, the most common diagnostic tools do not assess things like emotional health. They assess things like your cognitive function, your memory. We think about those as sort of memory diseases, when in reality, they are also equally psychiatric contributors. So we're going to talk about some of these things. I'd like to guide you through some of the most common symptoms that are associated with these types of diseases, just to put us all on the same page. So there will be 3 slides of these. The first symptom I'd like to talk about is agitation. So agitation is behavior that is consistent with emotional distress, including excessive movement, verbal aggression, or physical aggression. This is extremely common and is frequently described as one of the most challenging to work with and puts the greatest burden on the caregiver. That your loved one becomes more aggressive, becomes more agitated, more upset, seems like they're sort of on edge more frequently, and can really make things difficult. Can also make getting housing difficult because it's harder to manage that person. Second is depression. We'll talk a little bit more about depression later on, but depression and neurodegeneration are intricately interlinked. And depression, again, we're talking about that persistent feeling of sadness, hopelessness, and loss of interest in joyful activities. Depression is extremely common in neurodegeneration. The old theory was, oh, folks are sad because they have this disease. Now we understand that depression is part of the disease process because of changes to neurotransmitter systems that I'll talk about in a minute. Apathy is sometimes tricky to distinguish from depression because they can look the same, right? Apathy is a lack of motivation, a lack of interest in activities, and you see some of that in depression, a term we sometimes use as anhedonia, lack of joy. But apathy doesn't always carry the same lack of joy that depression does. But apathy can be really tough when you're trying to get somebody to take care of themselves and perform activities of daily living and hygiene and things like that, and there's just no interest in doing any of that stuff. Delusions are complex. So delusions can take a couple of different forms. These are beliefs resulting from inaccurate interpretations of reality. These can be things like misidentification, persecutorial, etc. So persecutorial is the belief that someone is watching you, someone is following you, that sort of thing. Misidentification can be a belief that you are someone you are not. There can also be delusions of, for example, spousal infidelity that are unfounded, but someone really gets convinced that that's what's going on, and it's very difficult to get someone out of these delusions once they are formed. Hallucinations, the interesting thing about hallucinations, so if you can imagine being in your home and there's a short in the wire in your doorbell. So inside your house, your doorbell is ringing. So every time it rings, you go to the door and you open the door and you look around, there's nobody there. To you, that behavior makes sense because the doorbell is ringing. To your neighbor across the street, all they see is you keep opening your door and looking around like a weirdo and they're like, what is going on? Folks who are having hallucinations, they are experiencing what they say they are experiencing. They are hearing the voices, they are seeing the things. It is not a misrepresentation, it is a compromise of those sensory systems. So they are really having that experience. It's just not an experience that's based in our shared reality. So that can be very tough. These, again, can be auditory, visual, etc. Anxiety is the persistent anticipation of danger, constant and excessive worry. Folks are worried about things that may not be, these worries may be disproportionate to the risk that circumstances present, but it's just this constant anxiety. One of the challenges with anxiety is that it can have other effects on your body. For example, anxiety creates stress hormones. So stress hormones suppress your immune system. Part of that is because in early evolution, if you were going to fight a bear or whatever, you didn't have to worry about fighting off a cold. You got to fight off the bear. So you shut down everything that isn't immediately necessary. But now in our modern world, we just have anxiety all the time. It's like bears are around us all the time. And so our immune systems become suppressed, and then we're more susceptible to infection. And finally, there's disinhibition. This is a loss of behavioral restraint resulting in impulsive behaviors. This could include things like inappropriate language, hypersexual behavior, or gambling, where things we used to have a handle on are just present now. And we have to monitor our loved ones' behavior because they're getting themselves in trouble. So I'll give you a sort of snapshot from Alzheimer's. How common are these things in Alzheimer's? Well, you can see here in this chart represents 48 different studies that looked at Alzheimer's, and they sort of compiled the results. And in the right column there is the percentage of folks who, with Alzheimer's in these studies, who had these things at some point in their experience. So again, very, very common, and the likelihood of having one of these things is super high, 75 to 90-some%. These behavioral symptoms are seen to varying degrees in all the major neurodegenerative diseases and more that are listed here. And I say to varying degree because each disease can have slightly different presentations. For example, dementia with Lewy bodies is very consistent with visual hallucinations. That's one of the hallmark features of dementia with Lewy bodies. Those visual hallucinations are less common in something like frontotemporal dementia, whereas aggression is much more common in frontotemporal dementia than in some of the other forms. So they can be there in each one, just to slightly varying degrees. And neurologists can use that as clues to help diagnose and to help treat, but it's something to be aware of. So how does any of this work? How do we get to this? And to do this, we're going to do a small primer on human behavior, which is the most complex thing to understand. So we're going to try to keep a very superficial version here. I'm going to divide this behavior into 3 phases. There's the stimulus, which is the thing that evokes the behavior. Something happens and you are going to respond to that thing. There's the processing phase where your nervous system is understanding what has happened, what that stimulus is, and planning a response to that. And then finally, the response itself, the carrying out of the response itself. So for example, if I am home alone at night and it's dark and I hear a spooky noise, I hear that noise, I think about what that noise might be, and I decide is my response going to be that I'm going to turn on the light? Am I going to go hide under the covers? All these different responses to choose from. So how does this work in terms of the hardware of your nervous system? What's doing all this stuff? So first we have sensory systems that take in that information, right? These are your eyes and ears and all the nerves that are involved in those things. Then those sensory systems pass that information along to 2 different parts of your nervous system. The first of these is your cerebral cortex. This is the thinkiest part of your brain. This is the part that is the most intellectual, the most sophisticated, the most civilized, that can do all the advanced planning, that knows all the stuff, really high-level part of your brain. Evolutionarily, this part of your brain is about 100,000 years old. Seems pretty okay, that's a pretty good number, right? Well, the other part of your nervous system that receives this sensory information is your amygdala and brainstem. These parts of your brain go back 500 million years. Why they go back 500 million years, right? They're conserved across so many species is because they are very, very good at keeping an organism alive under survival conditions. So this is the thing that triggers fight or flight. This is the thing that keeps you away from bad stuff and going toward good stuff. So that impulse of, I hear a spooky noise, I'm going to leave, evolutionarily, that's great for survival. So those parts also are still there in your nervous system. Now, both of these, in turn, talk to the parts of your nervous system that create a behavior, that make you run or make your heart go faster or make you sweat or whatever, make you scream out, whatever. Those systems receive instructions from both of these. So how does it work if both are getting instructions from two different things at the same time? Well, there is top-down control from the cortex to the amygdala and brainstem. Give you an example. You have a fear of snakes. You are watching an Indiana Jones movie and snakes appear on screen. Your heart might quicken a little bit, but your brain understands this is a movie. I don't need to be afraid of those snakes. If not for your cortex, your amygdala would see those snakes and go, you gotta leave this house. You gotta burn your house down. It's got snakes in it. Thankfully, we've got this top-down control that modulates our behavior. Now, neurotransmitters are what make all of these things work. Neurotransmitters are chemical messages that are exchanged between neurons to make your nervous system work. And these are just some of the neurotransmitters involved in this behavior, things like norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline, serotonin, dopamine, glutamate, and acetylcholine. You may have heard some of these before. All of these are changed in neurodegenerative diseases. So a little bit more about neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters can do a couple of different things. So on your left there, you've got a diagram of a synapse. A synapse just means a place where two neurons meet. The word actually means gap. And on top, we've got the neuron that's going to send a message, and on bottom, you've got the neuron that's going to receive that message. And that message is those little red dots there, just this chemical that's going to be released out, picked up by the other neuron. And when it's picked up by what we call receptors, things happen. Ions come in, other proteins are activated, but basically that's how the message works. So neurotransmitters can have different effects. They can make the second neuron more active, they can make it less active, or they can just change the way it's active, like change the timing of it or the pacing of it, that sort of stuff. And there's a Goldilocks effect in play here. So if you look at brain function compared to neurotransmitter activity, as we increase our amount of neurotransmitter, there's brain function that's bad, and then we get up to a place where it's good. This is called an inverted U curve. When we get to this middle part where we've got a certain level of neurotransmitter, brain function's great. If you go beyond that, brain function gets bad again. So too much or too little, no good. We want just the right amount. So you can imagine how in neurodegeneration, with these amounts changing, that's not great for brain function. So let's talk about what happens to behavior in that instance. So we're going to go through a couple of steps here. So the first thing to know is that the filter on your sensory systems breaks down. In reality, even right now as we sit here, your body is being exposed to way more sensory information than your brain wants or can use. So it filters a lot of that out, all sorts of stuff. But in neurodegeneration, that filter begins to break down. So where I heard one spooky noise before, now I'm hearing all the spooky noises. Was that the radiator turning on? Was that is that the cat outside? I'm starting to hear more things that might trigger a response. At the same time, neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and serotonin get altered. Norepinephrine becomes more active, serotonin becomes less active, and now the amygdala, its activity is kicked up. So it's more active and it's got more stuff to act on, to freak out about, and that's not a great recipe. Additionally, I mentioned that serotonin gets decreased, as does acetylcholine. One of the first drugs that's used in the treatment of dementia is a cholinesterase inhibitor that is designed to keep your levels of acetylcholine up. Because when acetylcholine drops down, your cortex stops working. It's akin to having your cortex removed. So this goes away, and the top-down control begins to fade. Dopamine is also affected, because it turns out that norepinephrine and serotonin have effects on dopamine release. So even though the dopamine hardware seems to be intact, that control begins to go away. And so now we've got bigger emotional responses. So when we think about agitation, how does somebody get agitated? There's more things to irritate them, and their irritation parts of their brain, their getting riled up parts of their brain are more active, and that top-down control is gone, and now we have bigger emotional and motor responses. Excess activity, tempers flare, all that sort of stuff. That's a very simple version of how agitation is happening in these diseases. What then can we do about any of this? So there are treatments. I'm going to bin these into two categories: non-pharmacologic, meaning you don't have to take a pill, and pharmacologic, meaning you get some drugs. So non-pharmacologic are usually described in the literature as the safest and best, to the extent that they work. None of these treatments I'm going to describe are a silver bullet. They're all, done with the best of intentions. So things like avoiding unmet needs of hunger and pain and boredom can be used to stave off agitation. So a lot of these are going to be focused on agitation. I'll talk about other symptoms in a second. But keeping folks happy, satisfying that ancient animal part of your brain that's eating and breathing and sleeping, that's helpful for avoiding agitation. Identifying stressors in the environment or daily routine. Changes in the daily routine can be upsetting to folks. Stressors in the environment, that fire alarm where the battery is running out and it's beeping that can be very upsetting to folks. Things that can also be used are things like distraction, to distract someone from the thing that's upsetting them. Outlets like exercise to help them get that excess energy out. Increased social engagement seems to help with agitation. Relaxation techniques including music therapy, which you heard about, aromatherapy, pet therapy, and even classical talk therapy or group therapy, things like that. Anything that can help to sort of calm down what might otherwise be agitating. And most importantly, caregiver support and training, right? These diseases are family diseases. These affect more than just the patient. So we want to make sure that the patient is able to, the caregiver is able to make it through this situation and take care of their loved one, even though that loved one is upset. For the pharmacologic treatments, there are a number, and the first slide I'm going to show you is sort of the recent history of these drugs. So there's a number of different options here. These are kind of the historical first line approaches. And these include things like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SNRIs. These are typically antidepressant medications. And they address some things like the changes in serotonin. And they have, they work sometimes and they work less well other times. And they can take some time to build up, sometimes weeks to build up. There can be side effects to these medications. People fail these medications because they start taking them and they find, oh, this gives me nausea or this gives me headaches, things like that. So again, none of these are silver bullets, but these are options to try to find something that will help for things like, for example, agitation or depression. Mood stabilizers have been used a lot in agitation. Mood stabilizers and dopamine blockers, which are antipsychotics. These have been used a lot. Varying effects. The risk with antipsychotics, which again can be very effective at calming somebody down, is they increase mortality. They open you up to other health risks. So it can be a very difficult balancing act between the suitability of someone's behavior and the long-term risk to their health. Even pro-memory medications, things like those cholinesterase inhibitors, can be useful for treating agitation because again we're trying to restore some of that cognitive function or support that cognitive function just so that we can get that top-down control on those behaviors. And then there's mention here of dextromethorphan, which I'll talk about in a second. So April was a surprisingly big month for medications related to agitation in Alzheimer's disease. Two very big things happened. The first is there's a medication called Rexulti. You may have seen ads for this or whatever. This helps serotonin inhibit behavior. So it's supporting the serotonergic system. It's helping to regulate that dopamine function, which allows you to control your behavior. And it decreases the effects of excess norepinephrine, so a lot of different things. It had been FDA approved in 2023 for agitation, but it cost a lot of money. So a lot of medical systems didn't have it on their formulary, they wouldn't cover it, that sort of thing. But as of 2026, April 2026, there's now a generic available. Now, I don't know how long it will take for that generic to actually hit shelves, because sometimes after the approval, there's a period of time. But this is an option of a different approach to try to treat agitation in Alzheimer's. Similarly, there's a combined medication that uses dextromethorphan and bupropion called Auvelity. This was just recently approved. This modulates glutamate signaling to try to support that cognitive function for that top-down control to get a handle on behaviors. And this was previously approved as an antidepressant, but they found that it had some effects on agitation. They went through the clinical approval process and got this clinically approved as of April 30th for agitation in Alzheimer's disease. It is not cheap. I want to say it's $1,500 a month, something like that. The hope is that eventually there will be, I don't know what insurance will cover of that. I could talk for 5 hours about insurance, but we'll hope for the best. But so there are new developments on the horizon, which is great. What about other symptoms? Are there any meds for other symptoms? So again, antidepressant and anti-anxiety medications exist that modulate these symptoms, that take into consideration what's going on. They can have side effects, but some people find them very helpful. There's a drug called pimavanserin that modulates serotonin to help with hallucinations and delusions. It's approved for Parkinson's disease, but I suspect will be tried in other diseases as well. There are other antipsychotics to help treat aggression. As I mentioned, those have some significant side effects. And then we talked about cholinesterase inhibitors being used. I want to just talk about two other things real quickly, and then I'll wrap up. One is this relationship of depression and dementia. We don't understand what the relationship is between depression and dementia. Is it causative? Is one causing the other? So here are some examples of what might be going on. Is depression a risk factor for dementia? Well, we know that a lot of folks who have dementia previously had a diagnosis of depression. But does that mean one causes the other, or is it one is increasing vulnerability for the other? We don't know. Is dementia actually a feature of advanced depression? There is a thing called pseudodementia, which is where you get depression and it causes dementia-like behaviors. All the same things you'd see in Alzheimer's, but it's caused by depression. When you treat the depression, that stuff goes away. So there must be some sort of connection between these two pathologies, but we just don't know what that is yet. So there's a lot of research being done on this. It's very interesting to think about. The takeaway should be, don't ignore depression. Depression should absolutely be addressed because history of depression, you're more likely to get dementia. Depression makes dementia worse. It makes it a more unpleasant experience for the patient, makes it harder to care for that patient. So don't sleep on depression. Speaking of sleep, the other thing I want to talk about is circadian dysfunction. So your circadian system is the system in your body that sets your internal clock, decides when you wake up and when you go to sleep. And we know that circadian systems are disrupted in dementia. Circadian systems are also frequently disrupted in mental illness. So depression, very, very common to have circadian disruption. Getting a handle on sleep, trying to help people sleep, get into a good sleep routine, healthy sleep, will help with the progression of dementia, will help with the management of mood symptoms, all that stuff. Sleep is really, really critical to brain health and human behavior. All right, that was a lot of information. How do we summarize? Psychiatric symptoms are extremely common in these diseases and should be talked about as such. They are part of the disease process and not anyone's fault or failing as a person. If you have depression, it's not because you're a bad person or you're not strong enough or whatever. It is because your brain is changing as a result of these diseases and should not be stigmatized or looked down on. It's just another feature of these diseases. Understanding the chemicals at play can give clues for effective treatments to these diseases. And indeed, there is help available. Again, not a silver bullet, but there is help available both through pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic means. Thank you for taking this journey with me into the mind.